Good day and welcome again to the next of our studies in our series End Times for Beginners, and you can see from the heading on the chart that the study this time is in Revelation in chapter number 18, and we've called it the Fall of Babylon. In our previous study we looked at the fall of religious Babylon, and now in this study we're going to look at the fall of commercial Babylon. Right away, of course, there is a question to answer, because some people will say that the two things are one and the same. And they also will say that the two judgments of God take place at exactly the same time. Chapter 17 and chapter 18 are just two different descriptions of the same thing and at the same time. We have to examine that as we go through the passage, but I think the answer to that is no. I think the emphasis in each of the two chapters is completely different. Chapter 17, it is judgment on the religious system which happens at the middle point of the 7-year period, because the dragon and the beast has no use for false religion from then on. Everyone and everything must worship him. But in chapter 16, when we read that there was a great earthquake and the cities of the nation fell and Babylon came up in remembrance, I think it's a clue there that at the end there will be only two cities standing for a point in time. Isn't that amazing? Two cities that are compared and contrasted right down through the prophecies of the Old Testament, Babylon and Jerusalem. And at the end of the 7-year period, when London and Tokyo and New York and Sydney and all the rest have gone, there will be Babylon, his center. And there will be Jerusalem, the place where Christ will come and reign. And even though it has been divided by the earthquake, it is still standing, but Babylon has come up in remembrance. And we're going to look at what that little word means. What does it mean? What does God remember? Things that he prophesied in his word in the past, and they have not yet been fulfilled to this day. And so we're going to look and see, does Babylon have a future judgment, and must there be a literal city? And I would say yes, if there is a city to be judged. Let's read in chapter 18 and verse number 1. After these things, that's important because that always notes in Revelation a time movement in John's progressive vision. That would indicate that what we have in 17 is a slightly different time from what we have in 18, and I think the time difference is actually 3.5 years. After these things I saw another angel come down out of heaven, having great authority, and the earth was lightened with his glory, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon is fallen, is become the habitation of demons, and the hold of foul spirits, and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Verse 4, I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sins, and you don't receive her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Verse number 9, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her shall bewail her and lament when they see the smoke of her burning standing afar off, and the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, the great city, the mighty city, for in 1 hour is her judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man shall buy their merchandise any more in her, merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and linen and purple and silk and scarlet and all manner of other things, and slaves, verse 13, and souls of men. Actually, in the passage in the original it says the bodies and souls of men. For in 1 hour, verse 17, so great riches are come to nothing, and every shipmaster and all the companies and ships and sailors and as many as trade by sea stood afar off and cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. And they said, What city was like unto the great city? And they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, Alas, the great city, wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour she is made desolate. Rejoice over her, the heaven, And ye holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you of her. And a mighty angel took a stone like a great millstone and cast it into the sea, saying, Thus with violence shall the great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. Verse 21. We know that God blesses his reading of his word. Is this a literal city? I think that even in the verses that we have read together, I think that if there's nothing else in the Word of God to confirm, I think if you were reading it for the first time, I think you would have to agree with me and say, yes, it sounds like a real place, a real city, with real people working and active in commercial trading, a seaport with shipping and merchant men. I picture in my mind container ships and clearance and harbours and customs and tradings and services and offices and stocks and shares. And in the middle of it all, perhaps a great palace, and in the palace a throne, and on the throne the king, the one the Bible calls the beast, because he comes at the very beginning of the 7-year period on his white horse peaceably, and he's given a kingdom without fighting a war, because other kings give their authority to him, and in turn he gives them a kind of a little bit of authority, a cabinet rule with him. Jerusalem is not his centre, no. Jerusalem might be the place where his image is set up, and where he begins his false worship, where the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke about in Jesus 2 is seen first. But I don't think Jerusalem will be his capital city. I think there has to be a Babylon, because Babylon has to be destroyed. You see, way back in Daniel chapter number 9, Daniel said the coming prince was going to stop the sacrifice and stop the offerings. It doesn't tell us that there would be a third temple built. But there has to be a sanctuary in Temple Mount. There has to be a priesthood. There has to be their red heifer for their sprinkling of their clean water. And there has to be trained priests. And there has to be pure lambs. And there has to be sacrifices. And there has to be gift offering. And there has to be poured out offerings. All of those must take place before he can cause them to stop. And likewise here in Revelation chapter number 18, if there's going to be a Babylon that will be destroyed, I'm suggesting to you there has to be a Babylon that will be built. If you go to Iraq today, I'm not sure if we'd be allowed to go to Iraq today, but if you can go on Google, or you can go on the internet, or you can go in all kinds of ways nowadays. You can see things that you've never seen before. And if you look in the southern province of Babel, in what the Bible calls the land of Shinar, you will still find a city that's called Babylon. You will actually find that there are villages, there is a whole complex round about the city of Babylon, and there's probably about 2 million Arabs that live away down there in that southern province. Most of them perhaps live in tents, some of them live in villages, but they live around what is still the remains of the old original city of Babylon. There was a king in Iraq, I'll call him a king, not too many years ago. His name was Saddam Hussein, and one of his big projects was to rebuild the city of Babylon, and he spent billions of dollars on it. He was actually having bricks made with his own name on it, just like Nebuchadnezzar did in a previous day, and he rebuilt, as the first part of his reconstruction in all its beauty and glory, the Ishtar Gate, a thing deeply connected with false worship. And if that word Ishtar sounds like our English word Easter, there is a very good reason, because they actually are connected. And that's not our study today. And Saddam did all those things and intended to do much more. And if you even went on Google Maps, you would find photographs today of some of those walls still standing from Nebuchadnezzar's time, 30, 40 meters high, over 100 feet. Babylon crumbled and faded. But Babylon was never burned. Babylon was never destroyed. Babylon, even when the Medes and Persians came in Daniel chapter 5, it was done by subtlety. They got into the city in the night by turning off the water and getting in past the dam and overtaking the soldiers inside and opening the gates. They didn't even have to burn them or destroy them from the outside. You say, is that important? It is. Because when you go back into the prophecies of the Old Testament, and here's our clue, God tells us things in Isaiah and Jeremiah that he's going to do to Babylon that never have been done. Babylon never has been burned in all her history. And even if she had been burned by attacking soldiers, she never has been burned by a fire that came down from heaven. No. Jeremiah and Isaiah, both of them wrote in great detail about the future destruction of Babylon. In Isaiah chapter 13, it says Babylon will be like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will be destroyed by the fire of God, which will come down. Jeremiah 51 says her walls shall be broken and her gates shall be burned. Jeremiah 50 says nobody will ever live in her again. She will be a dwelling place for owls and dragons. Jeremiah 51 says God will make of her a burnt nation. The whole province will be desolate, and she will remain desolate forever. And yet when we come to this passage, we see something that is working and moving and has a beating heart. A commercial system. You say, I thought the shipping was destroyed. No, only a third. That maybe even some of that is being replenished, and 2/3 of the massive shipping fleet of the world is still working and moving because they have given allegiance, and they've got the stamp, and they've got the number, and they've got the name, they've got the clearance, and so they're working in conjunction with the beast and his kingdom, and they're still trading with his super city of Babylon that I believe he's going to build and rebuild and put back up again like a super Abu Dhabi in the desert, on the banks of the Euphrates River, and he's going to do it in a day to come, maybe just in a month or two at the start of a 7-year kingdom. And he's going to rule and reign not from Jerusalem, he's going to rule and reign from his brand new capital city that nobody else has reigned in before. It will be his and it will be new. And in it he probably will have a literal throne, because the throne of the beast is a number of times referred to. He'll have a palace and a throne, just like there is in the city of London. Just a massive representation of that, only bigger, a king ruling over a great part of the world and sitting on a throne in his palace. And you say, but Babylon back then was maybe close to Euphrates River, but certainly not a waterway that ships can come up. Well, that can be changed. I think that will happen. I think whether from previous earthquakes or maybe even because of that and repair and the great excavation project, I don't see any problem with that at all. He will turn Babylon into a seaport on the early part of the Euphrates River and link directly through to the Persian Gulf. After all, it's just a counterfeit, isn't it? Because God is going to allow the dragon to counterfeit almost everything. And Jerusalem and the kingdom, because of the earthquake in Zechariah 14, it's going to change, and it's going to be connected by a waterway that goes out to the Mediterranean Sea. And so I think that the dragon will decide that it's very clever in his plan with his man to counterfeit everything that he can, and have his capital and his city and his seat and his throne and his temple maybe as well, and his commercial system on the waterway of Euphrates stretching out into the Persian Gulf. What an amazing thought in the Word of God. What about the sentence of doom that is passed on this brand new city of Babylon that will be left standing at the last when all the other cities have fallen? A sentence of doom, we have that in the first part of the passage because of her influence. because she had an influence over all nations. A sentence of doom because of her iniquity. The Bible says her sins have followed her up to heaven. The stink of what Babylon represents has become a stench in the nostrils of God. Her infidelity, she lived in luxury with the kings of the earth and the mighty men and the rich men and all the other fornications and sinful living that's linked in with that, and their inhumanity. Not only the blood of the prophets and the martyrs, that doesn't surprise us, but in the passage we read about the bodies and souls of men. I don't think that's martyrs. I think that's a reference to human trafficking. We used to call it slave trading hundreds of years ago. We thought it had been rubbed out, and Britain took much of the credit for bringing it to a conclusion. Now it's back. And maybe Britain in the Western world is in the forefront of the benefit. Right even as close as my hometown, human trafficking. Bodies and souls of men and women, girls and boys and people, bought and sold as commodities, and they count for nothing except items of trade. That's the kind of evil, wicked world that we are living in today, and Babylon will be the capital of that as well. None of those things go unnoticed by God, and at the end of the day, God will judge her. She will be the center of all of it. God will judge her for the sins of all those who have lived in it. For cities in the world take their character from the people that live in them. There is the summons on the believers to depart. I don't want to spend a lot of time there. God says to the old tribulation saints that are here, some of them will still be living. I don't quite understand, but God says it, and so it must be true. They don't have the mark because they're God's. Get out of her, my people. Don't let one of you be left, because my judgment upon her, like Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, because there's a comparison. We read that. Like Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, he was a righteous man living in the wrong place with an unrighteous family. Get out before the judgment comes. And God is always saying that kind of thing to his people. Don't touch the unclean thing. He tells us that in Isaiah. Come out of the midst of Babylon. He says that prophetically in Jeremiah 51. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and 14, that's speaking to us. Do not be unequally yoked together with anything to do with unbelievers. We can apply that in whatever sense we want. And in Revelation chapter 18 and verse number 4, he says, come out of her, my people. It's his last appeal. Before the very judgment and fire of God from heaven falls on this iniquitous, idolatrous, economic, social, physical, moral, social, virtual, wicked city. Just like Sodom. Just like the conditions that Lot was in all those years ago. An economic system, a social system, a physical system, a moral system, a social system, but I added in the last one that Lot knew nothing about. A virtual system. We benefit from it and take advantage of it, but I tell you this, it will be also very quickly totally corrupted and totally controlled by the mark and the number and the name. And what kind of way this city will operate technologically is even way beyond our understanding, but it will. It will rise and fall from beginning to end in less than 7 years. What a mystery. God will pour out his judgment on Babylon because of her sins. The sorrow of all the brokers, here's my next little section. It goes from 9 down to 20. It's the longest part of the passage. The sorrow of the brokers at their end. I've called them brokers because that's just a word to link everybody together. The kings of the earth. I think that's literal because there's him, he is a king, and there's other kings that he gives authority to. We had that in the previous chapter. And they're all going to sit together like his G10, his cabinet round his table, and they're going to rule with him. and the merchantmen, the head of the great corporations. We live in a world in which many of the greatest corporations of the world are controlled by one man. Not many, not a group, not a board. Individuals. And there seems to be a kind of a race among them as to which one is the wealthiest man in the world. How you can measure that, I'm not very sure. We were told just last week that it had flipped again. It wasn't Mr. Zuckerberg, and it wasn't Mr. Bezos, and it wasn't some of these other strange people that we don't ever get to meet, but we hear about their names, that they've now become Mr. Musk. That'll maybe last for a month or two, and then something else will increase in value, and it will change again. One man worth billions and billions and billions of dollars beyond our understanding. It's the world we're living in, and it's looking very like that world there. And the merchantmen and the corporate heads, they're going to mourn because of the complete and total breakdown of the system that they've enjoyed and relaxed and rejoiced in and made their money from. And the shipping magnates, that's not so hard to understand. The men that control. You say, I thought the shipping was destroyed. No, there's still 2/3 of it, and maybe some of it will even grow again. And what's left will be even busier because part of the competition will have been judged and rubbed out in the trumpet judgments. And there will be ship owners, and they'll still be making a fortune at the very last days of tribulation because the prices of commodities will have gone through the roof. And so what they're moving around and selling, their profit margins will be 10 times greater than it was at the start of the 7-year period. They'll be glad of all the trouble because they'll be making more money, and they'll not have a problem with the mark. And so when all of it comes crashing down in a burning mass that God pours out his judgment on like Sodom and Gomorrah, no surprise, I believe it's literal. And every pilot, it says. Shipmaster in the King James Bible, but in the original the word is pilot. I think that's proof in itself that there will be a navigatable waterway up the Euphrates River. But of course, as we know, in those kind of situations where it's delicate and very, very determined in relation to where you go and what markers and buoys you move around, the captain gives place to a pilot, and he takes the vessel up to the wharf and ties it up before it's discharged of its cargo. The very pilots and the ship masters and the ship owners, the whole way up the chain to the top, they're all going to stand afar off. And they're going to weep and cry at the burning and destruction of the system that God is pulling down. The binding symbol, I'm taking those words straight out of the passage, the binding symbol of her destruction. This is amazing, isn't it? Quoting from Jeremiah 51, yet there's one word difference, and I think that even proves some of the things that we have said. Jeremiah said to the people he didn't understand it, neither did they, because they thought that Jerusalem was just about to be destroyed by the Babylonians. And Jeremiah said there's going to come a day when God will destroy Babylon. Bind a stone to the book of the prophecy as Jeremiah gave it. Somebody wrote it down, he had a scribe. Bind a stone to the book of the prophecy and cast it into the Euphrates River. Thus shall Babylon sink. Jeremiah 51 and 63. Then you come to Revelation 18 and verse number 21. The mighty angel took a great stone and he cast it into the Euphrates. No, he cast it into the sea. And he said, thus shall Babylon sink. Fulfilling the prophecy of Jeremiah 51, but changing a word. Because I do believe that the Persian Gulf, the sea, will have been linked with the Euphrates River right up as far as the wharfs of Babylon city. And so the prophecy is altered to be absolutely literal. Bind it and cast it into the sea, the Persian Gulf. Thus shall Babylon be thrown down. A city which today we forget that it's literal. It's still out there in Babel province in southern Iraq and 2 million people in it. And very soon, when this man appears, because he's coming soon, he's going to start a massive regenerating and rebuilding program. And he's going to build a city which will set Dubai and Abu Dhabi and London and New York and all the other skyscraper cities of the world in the shade. It's going to be his capital, his commercial centre, his ruling centre, his religious centre. The centre of this part of our world, east and west, as we know it. He won't rule the whole world, but he'll rule a great part of it. And he's going to sit there for 7 years, and his authority is going to increase and grow the more that time passes, and the more power the dragon gives him, and the more people that bow before him, until the whole thing comes to a crashing end in the last bowl judgment, and God pours out the fiery judgment like Sodom and Gomorrah upon the city and brings it down. Why? Because Babylon thought that she would never sit like the widow of Jerusalem, and she would never see the destruction of her children. And God said, what she did to my city and my people and the throne of my son, Jerusalem, I will do to her. God always keeps his word. And so in a day that's coming, he will. And Babylon that will be rebuilt, the literal city, will literally be judged by a literal fire that comes down from God out of heaven. Little wonder, the Bible says, come out of her, my people, and be separated from her, and be not. That applies to us today in a spiritual sense. Be not partakers of the sins of this Babylon system in which we live. Some questions and answers now for the young people that have been patient and studying through these more difficult chapters in the middle of the book. I do admit that. Do both Babylon visions happen at the same time? You should be able to have a clear answer for that, and if the answer you give is no, well then maybe you could suggest the time difference between the two pieces of the vision, the two chapters. If the woman in chapter 17 is religious, the city in chapter 18 is what? Who was associated with Babylon back in the book of Genesis? You can give me a name there, and also something else that they built. Babylon was a city, but it also was a centre of something else. And you should be able to give me an answer for that from Genesis as well. And then they built a tower back in Genesis chapter 11, and of course what was the tower connected with? Because those things are all foreshadowings of what is coming here and what is still future. What cities in the Old Testament that God destroyed does he compare the destruction of Babylon to? Now, I gave you that answer and quoted the passage, so you should be able to find that. What will happen to Babylon that never has happened to it before? And why does God bring his judgment at the last upon what I believe is the literal city and the commercial system of Babylon in a day to come? Why will God judge it? And the answers now, as we usually give, the answers to the previous one, number 16, about the religious Babylon, and the answers to the question there. I asked you about 4 ladies, 4 women in the book of Revelation. Can you give me their names? And then for the real students, can you give me the chapter numbers that they're in? Jezebel in chapter 2, Israel in chapter 12, the harlot in chapter 17, and the Lamb's wife in chapter number 21. And those, of course, were linked with 4 different positions that John saw them from, but I didn't ask you to answer that. Who does the woman represent? She represents the false religious system of the world. Who is the beast that she's sitting on? It is the first beast that we have here, the beast that is worshipped, the beast that comes out of the abyss. Is the woman in control? Oh, she thinks she is, but she's absolutely not. Who is in control? Oh, you say that, no, not the dragon. It's not the dragon who's in control. It's not the beast she's sitting on. I hope we've learned that by now. It is God who is in control. How do we know that? That was the last question, because it is God that controls the method and manner of her destruction. So if you have answered those questions correct, you have done very, very well in what has possibly been, in that study, maybe number 16, the hardest study of all, maybe in the whole book. It gets a little bit easier as we get towards the end. We've done 17 today, the commercial Babylon, and the one that's going to come, number 18. If you have the patience for that, then we're going to step back again a little bit, and we're going to look at something we just mentioned in chapter number 16 on the way past, Armageddon. A very interesting term that most people have heard of, the 4 horsemen, the 666, and Armageddon. Those are probably the 3 best known symbols in the book of Revelation. So we're going to spend a whole study, a whole video in the next one, and we're going to look at the history of and the future of Armageddon. That will be a very interesting study. But thank you again for listening now, and may God bless you and bless your families, everyone, in these difficult times. And thank you again for listening.